I am glad to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation to this colloquium. And what I am going to talk today is something that is work in progress related with a topic I have been working for a couple of years from different perspectives, trying to relate some work in the cognitive sciences with discussions in the philosophy of science and in the social sciences about rationality and reasoning. And in particular, the way in which material culture plays a crucial role in organizing, articulating, scaffolding reasoning. That is the basic idea that I am trying to follow in different ways. What I'm going to try to do now is to suggest how the notion of the concept of habit can play a role in this sort of project. And in order to do that, I am going to let me see 1 second. What I'm trying to do today is trying to show how evolutionary models of the origin of language that make the important point that gesture play a crucial role in the origin of language, has implications for discussions about what is reason. That is the basic idea. So, I want to come to the idea that reasoning has to be understood or can be understood as a collection of habits of reasoning associated with the origin of language and our distinctive human capacities, and which involve what Sperber and Mercier calls intuitive and reflective inference, and what other people call system 1, system 2 inference. I will not at all talk about intuitive and reflective inference of system 1 and system 2 inferences, but it's just to, why I mention that is because it is going to play a very important role in my argument. The non-conscious role of many inferences in reasoning that lead to important decisions. And there is where, in this articulation of non-conscious inferences in a way that fits patterns of resonance that enter into decision-making, for example, is where habits can play a role. The idea, we will then want to try to say that reasoning is embodied in habits of reasoning. And in order to do that, we start with trying to show that reasoning competences embodied in habits suggest a natural way in which we can see that not only reflective inferences, but also intuitive inferences are articulated and coordinated in social life. In the context of the talk, I will suggest how such habits of reasoning can be seen as evolving with language and how, in particular, we can make analogy with the way in which, in cognitive linguistics, it is claimed that the origin of language is gesture. Often, what is good reasoning is identified with the following of normatively correct rules. Famous experiments in psychology assume that cognitive explanations consist of models that represent phenomena in terms of information processing. This leads to questioning the importance of logic as inference and gives place to models of reasoning like those proposed by Newell and Simon, and to views of reasoning like Gigerenzer that reduce reasoning to decision tools. This line of approach that leads to think of reasoning as and separates a kind of reasoning as heuristic reasoning, and leads to the idea that reasoning is ultimately or should be characterized as reasoning tools, as heuristics, as a box tool, como as Gigerenzer says, as a toolbox, is developed very much in opposition, and Gigerenzer, that's the way he develops his program, no? In opposition to Kahneman and Tversky idea of what heuristic reasoning is. For Kahneman and Tversky, heuristic is very much a competence, and so it is very much related with norms, and it's something that is structured through norms that they assume the norms are given by formal rules of logic or probability. Now, the basic worry that started me on this idea is that actually heuristic, to start with, I have never been convinced that heuristic reasoning is, say, a natural kind of reasoning. There is not any specific distinction of what different people call heuristic reasoning from reasoning. We are just talking about reasoning. And the problem is that reasoning is a lot of different things. So, also, I think that the discussion of that Kahneman and Tversky have a lot to say about what is heuristic reasoning as a normative, as a kind of normative inference, that it is quite relevant for a lot of discussions in the sciences and everyday life. And also Gigerenzer is right that reasoning very often is tools. So in a way, both of them seems to be right to some extent about what is reason, about some part of what is reason. And the question is it is not possible to think of the idea of heuristic reasoning as a tool, and also as a toolbox, and as a competence. So the problems that Gigerenzer and the ABC group that have developed these ideas have with the notion of heuristic thinking has very much to do with the fact that they have no natural way of saying in what sense reasoning is normal. And that is the sort of the problem that they, I think, so have to confront. What I'm going to try to suggest is that one way of connecting these two notions of reasoning that are associated with Gigerenzer and Kahneman and Tversky can be connected through the notion of habit. we think that habits are embodied that reasoning is embodied in habits, and then we can understand in what sense heuristic reasoning is a norm and at the same time a tool. For Watson and Kahneman and Tversky, the norms of good reasoning are formal rules. But experiments point to the difficulty which our competence of reasoning has in shifting frames of reference. That's how Watson puts it. This is a quotation from Watson in a paper in which he discusses his experiments and the implications of his experiments for a general notion of reasoning and rationality. On a much smaller scale, what do our students remind us of in real life? They are like saying, of course the earth is flat, of course we are descended from Adam and Eve, of course space has nothing to do with time. The old ways of seeing things now look like absurd prejudice, but our highly intelligent students, volunteers, displayed analogous miniature prejudice when their premature conclusions are challenged by the facts. As Kuhn has shown, all paradigms do not die in the face of a few counterexamples. In the same way, our volunteers do not often accommodate their thought to new observations, even those governed by logical necessity in a deceptive problem situation. They will frequently deny the facts or contradict themselves rather than shift the frame of reference. The problem is that they are clearly thinking as a competence. But what is the relevant frame of reference for a competence? That is what is not obvious. And it is, as one can see, the challenge that Gerenzer has made. How we can characterize this competence. It is far from obvious that we can characterize it in the laboratory. At least it is not obvious that such frame of reference can be characterized in the sort of experiments that wasn't carried out. He assumed that this had to be the case because he assumed that if there is a way in which science can characterize such competence, it should be characterizable in the laboratory. And that is questioned. It's not necessarily, the best way of characterizing the frame of reference in this sense is in laboratory studies. And also, why to assume that we are dealing with one competence as opposed to many? What I'm trying to suggest is that the best way of characterizing this competence is through an evolutionary model of the norms of reasoning. So, is heuristic reasoning a competence or a toolbox? Gerenzer has developed his account on the assumption that heuristic reasoning as a competence and heuristic reasoning as tool is a crucial dichotomy. But that is what I think can be questioned. Heuristic reasoning can be understood as a competence and a toolbox. All we need is to find a way of characterizing the normativity proper of the competence of this. Or alternatively, the opposition could vanish if we are able to characterize reasoning as different kinds of reasoning associated with different competences. And that's another possibility. And then the basic point is that there is not only one way in which we could characterize competence. It is possible to find a way of thinking of our intuitive decisions as just part of our reasoning competence. And now, one difficulty if we try to approach the problem this way is that the reasoning involved in heuristic decision making, for example, seems to be quite different from the sort of symbolic reasoning that is used in other places, and that is involved in a lot of other reasoning tasks. So, if you want an example of a kind of reasoning that is clearly not, that doesn't have the constraints associated with heuristic reasoning, that is the sort of symbolic reasoning that takes place in mathematics. Symbolic reasoning is often characterized as the sort of reasoning that answers to formal rules of inference. But is that a sharp distinction? I want to question that this is a sharp distinction. What I'm going to do, I guess, I hope you see it, is trying to erode the dichotomy that is behind the distinction between heuristic reasoning as toolbox and heuristic reasoning as complex. And ultimately saying that in a sense, all reason has some sort of, some elements of this, what we call heuristic reasoning. What is symbolic reasoning? Two common answers. Computationally holds that the symbolic reasoning is syntactic rule-based symbol manipulation that takes place in a central reasoning system. Semanticism says that symbolic reasoning takes place in models that represent and interpret mathematical and logical relations. Instead of syntactic rules, reasoning consists in an interpretation in a given mathematical system. Both kinds of accounts share the assumption that processes of perception and action play a minor role in symbolic reasoning. And I'm going to use some literature of Landy, Goldstone, and several other people who have been working on the importance of perceptual constraints in symbolic reasoning, and that they identify this shared assumption behind these two ways of characterizing symbolic reasoning as the assumption that reasoning is essentially translation. Processes of perception and action do little other than mediate between notational structures in the external environment and the internal structures and processes in which symbolic reasoning really occurs. Now, Landy Goldstone, in a paper in 2014 and several papers before, distinguished translational accounts from constitutive accounts. In constitutive accounts, sensory motor mechanisms are crucially involved in transforming the problem representation into one more manageable semantic structure. So, sensory motor mechanisms play a crucial, well, they claim is that even in symbolic reasoning in mathematics, sensory motor mechanisms play an important role in symbolic reasoning. For Landy, much of the capacity of symbolic reasoning is implemented at the perceptual level, as the perception, manipulation, and modal and cross-modal representation of externally perceived notation. Similarly to Dörfer, Landy notational systems should be considered physical objects rather than meaning carrying symbols, or as I prefer to put it, notational systems should be considered material culture playing a role in the process of thinking. Reasoning in Landy's proposal, then, should be seen as an interaction between typically visual processes and reasoning capacities that go back and forth as it was in a dialogue. Reasoning capacities are, so to say, use perceptual reasoning and then go back and try to elaborate the inference and forth. And that's why I think that one can talk of dialogue with these two different capacities. Now, putting these results in an evolutionary perspective, what I'm trying to do, I don't know if you have seen that, but what I'm trying to do is first argue that even symbolic reasoning it's a kind of reasoning that is very closely related with our sensory motor uh, capacities that later will play an important role in the gestural origin of language and other reasoning capacities. So that's what I'm trying to do, trying to bring back the idea of symbolic reasoning, and later so that it is accessible to us. This is from well. Now I will try to show you how that relates to an explanation of the origin of language, a gestural explanation of the origin of gesture. In the 1960s, in a famous paper in 1960, Stockholm, cognitive linguist, put forward the claim that sign language was not a derived language from English, or a very common idea in this country, that somehow sign language was not really a language, but really did not have a grammar as English or any other language as a grammar. And then this idea was further developed, and it's basically now widely accepted. And many people started working then in the gestural origins of language later on the basis of the idea that, well, you see, if the sign language is a language, say, it's a language in the sense of grammar, semantics, and pragmatics, and it is in a sense equal to English, then we could learn something about the origin of language through studying sign gesture. So many people, including the Barona and Strick, have done a lot of work, experimental work, on how gestures are turned into symbols. How different gestures in the sign languages turn into symbols and are used as carriers of reason. And then part of that is this idea that they say that they arrive to through this idea that the formation of a symbol is a defining moment in the fabrication of shared knowledge, because it allows the participants to focus upon and re-invoke previously shared experiences, and to plan and conduct shared activities in their way. An important version of this process is langage d'action, the performance of schematic motor actions that are abstracted from actions in the material world, in a word gesture. That is what they mean with a gesture. The performance of a schematic motor action abstracted from actions in the material world. Now, even if we accept that, if we accept this characterization of gesture, it is not obvious that we can extend this, something like this account, that we cannot work through analogy to an account in which that would give us that shed light on what is symbolic reason. That requires further steps. And one of these steps, I suggest, is that this extension can be carried out and exploited to help account for the tension we started with between heuristic reasoning and as competence and heuristic reasoning as tools. Now, first of all, of course, it is clear, I would say, widely accepted that our reasoning competence are closely related with our capacity for symbolic language. One major obstacle for the sort of extension I am suggesting from symbolic gestures to reasoning is usual account of the origin of language. An explanation of the origin of language based on formal logic or a mechanistic metaphor has no place for sort of extension, or at least it would be much harder to do. So that's why I think that the sort of model developed by cognitive linguists about, and in particular, the sort of model developed by the Stockholm, Armstrong, Wilcox, and other people that have worked in this direction is a quite promising way of looking at how ultimately the idea is that habits will be a kind of gesture. It will be a socialized gesture, and that this is that is where I'm going to make the connection with discussions about reasoning and rationality. One of the major hypotheses guiding the cognitive approach to language, in cognitive linguistics in particular, is that knowledge of language emerges from language use. But more relevant for us, for cognitive linguistics, all grammar is seen as essentially symbolic. So, to the extent that we are able to explain grammar, we are able to explain the origin of symbolic. And here is how Stockholm characterizes his proposal of cognitive linguistics. This is from a paper in 1976, when he already is working on the model of the origin of language. In philosophy, it's much more known. I guess you might know Bickerton or Corvallis or Sterrenli, who have worked a lot on this stuff. I'm not going to mention them, but certainly that is quite relevant. I think that this literature is more relevant for me because of the way of in which they focus on precisely on the origin of grammar, but I will not go into that discussion. And basically, the idea of semantic phonology of Stockholm. Stockholm says that the usual way of conceiving the structure of language is linear. First, there are the sounds, then there are classes, morphology. The words, in turn, are found to be of various classes, and these are used to phrase structure. And finally, the phrase structure after lexical replacement of the symbol here mean. A semantic phonology ties the last step to the first, making a seamless circuit of this progression. The metaphor for semantic phonology that jumps to mind is the Möbius strip. The input is the output with a twist. Now, of course, that sounds like a very, very strange metaphor. But it is interesting. I think so that this metaphor can be reformulated using an ideas that are nowadays discussed in niche construction theory, in models of evolutionary, cultural evolution, and then and use this the idea of niche construction to reformulate the basic idea of Stockholm. For example, in niche construction theory, one of the basic discussions is about what is this sort of causality that, in a way, is not linear causality, and that sort of is involved in the construction, in the evolutionary role of niche construction. So I just say that in order to, it's not there's not a reason to dismiss this kind of approach, the fact that it is grounded in this sort of method. As Armstrong and Wilcox put the idea in a more or less recent paper, is hands and their action are iconic manifestations of the conceptual archetypes that are the prelinguistic source of grammatical structures. Hands are prototypical nouns, and their actions are prototypical verbs. So the gestures are both things at the same time. And that is what former. Cognitive linguists claim that grammar is intrinsically symbolic. By using the term symbolic, cognitive linguists do not mean that grammar can be described in terms of symbols that are manipulated by a set of rules that make no reference to the meanings of the symbols, as in Chomsky's generative grammar. Instead, the term symbol refers to a unit that has both phonological and semantic structure. And the idea is that this idea of symbol really is appropriate to characterize symbolic reasoning even in mathematics, particularly after the work of Armstrong and Wilcox claim that the evolution of language requires the presence of some cognitive ability, ritualization, and visible gesture. Ritualization, they say, involves repetition, or more appropriately, I think, we should say that it involves a capacity for reproduction and thus development. In this perspective, in this terminology, I would say that a ritualized gesture is what we will call the cognitive linguistic approach depends on a number of basic cognitive abilities to account for the function of grammar. The ability, basically, it is the idea is that you have to get resources from comparative cognition, and that then you have to find the way of identifying these cognitive abilities that will allow to explain what the function of grammar without requiring something, without requiring, say, a creationist need. And then what you require are abilities. The ability to form a structured conceptualization, the ability to establish correspondence between components of different conceptualizations, and entrenchment, also called routinization, automatization, and habituation. This is the process in which, through repetition, a complex structure comes to be manipulable as a prepackaged assembly. Now, notice this ability. This is precisely the idea of entrenchment, but it's also very important in models of evolutionary culture, and that and relate, you see, entrenchment with routinization, automatization, and habituation. So that is the important. That is the important thing for us. For them, they are connecting clearly routinization, automatization, and habituation. And I will come to that later. Usually that is thought not to play an important role in account of reasoning, but I think that that's wrong. This is the process in which through repetition varies. It is through entrenchment that a complex structure becomes manipulable as a unit. The unit becomes reified. And it also is interesting the notion of abstraction they use. Abstraction, or the emergence of a structure through reinforcement of the commonality inherent in multiple activities. This notion of abstraction certainly doesn't fit the traditional idea of abstraction that is used in a lot of cognitive sciences and when we discuss symbolic reasoning. But I think that this notion of abstraction is very important, and one can find in the literature, the contemporary literature, support for this way of understanding. Now, the important thing is that this way of characterizing abstraction is closely related. It will play a very important role in connection with this notion of entrenchment that leads to habituation. Now, and now I'm going again to switch just to make finally the connection with habits from a different perspective. I'm trying to make the point that evolutionary models of the origin of the evolutionary models of the origin of language, assuming that language is, first of all, is initially gestural language, play an important role in the development of the abilities, capacities, and competence that led to the development of language in the hominid lineage, and the associated, related reasoning capacities that we associate with distinctive cognitive capacities. It's not a 2003 paper, but it's a 2008 paper. Drolet and Supes argue for an approach to rationality based on a deeper model of the psychological phenomenon of choice. And they try to bring back the Aristotelian idea of reasoning based on habits. So, of course, I am going towards the idea ultimately to recovering the old Aristotelian idea of reasoning as habits of reasoning. And what I want to point out is that there are some interesting work on this area that is basically ignored. I suspect most of you don't know about this paper by Supes and some other people in 2005, 2008, something like that, in which they argue for this approach to rationality, a deeper model of the psychological phenomenon of choice. And they say that we adopt an Aristotelian view which covers a wider range of human behavior compared to classical theories exposed by economists, statisticians, and philosophers. In a way, I like to bring Supes into the discussion because Supes is very well known for having played an important role in the development of theories of rational decision. This theory is based on the concept of preference. Our view is grounded in the concept of association and habit. We conducted a large empirical study of good and bad habits. They did several experiments. And what they show, and they have some very nice graphics to show that, is that people agree a lot about what is a good habit and what is a bad habit in relation to rational decision making. And so they think that it's an empirical basis for this approach. They conducted a large empirical study of good and bad habits. The results strongly demonstrated how much agreement there is on judgments of what is good and what is bad, which is contrary to the mere relativity of preference commonly assumed. We propose to replace maximizing expected utility by having habits constituted constraints on choices. And the decision maker lets his association determine his selection from the constraint choice set, whether consciously or unconsciously. In another paper, Supes make very clear that it is the important part of this project to take in consideration the fact that a lot of the inference involved in reasoning is unconscious inference, and that is important in order to be able to formulate this account of rationality based on habits. And then he says, my proposal is that the concept of habit as constraint on choices can be enriched by the way in which habits are understood in cognitive linguistics in such a way that habits of reasoning are not only constraints, but norms of good reasoning. That is, I want to go beyond what Supes said. In a way, he is basically describing phenomenologically a fact that habits play a very important role in what we consider good reasoning. And I want to go beyond that and say that the evolutionary origin of gestures and that can be extrapolated to habits support the view of the importance of habits, but also leads us to understand also the origin of the normativity that is related with the different rational habits. From the use of gestures, the relevant normativity for understanding the tools of reasoning as competence emerges from use, reproduce, and structure of human development. That is then the connection. That's the way in which I think it could be mainly a connection between heuristic reasoning as the toolbox and heuristic reasoning as competence. Okay.
Okay, Okay, we have some minutes for questions.
I mean, thank you, first of all, because it's a very complex proposal. So I want to make just a very basic question regarding the advantages of expanding the notion of symbol this way, because I think there's a risk of your proposal trivializing what is for something to be symbolic. There is the risk of, ¿o quieres que te lo pregunte en español? Mejor, ¿verdad? A lo mismo. Ok, es que me preocupa que tu propuesta, al expandir tanto la noción de símbolo, o sea, porque le estás quitando toda esta parte de que tiene que ser sintáctico, tiene que ser lógico, tiene que ser articulado, no se trivialice, porque tal y como lo pones, parece que cualquier herramienta cognitiva que usemos habitualmente va a ser un símbolo, porque satisface todo. Entonces, eso es lo que quieres proponer, está bien. Entonces, lo que quiero saber es qué ventajas tiene adoptar esta perspectiva tan amplia de lo que es un símbolo.
What I want to say is that the way that no sé, ¿no soy ahí? Apagado entonces. ¿Sí? ¿Ahora sí? No. ¿Ahora sí? Bueno. Symbolic. If we, yeah, the proposal is that symbolic reason, that a lot of our reasoning is symbolic. And in a sense, in the very general sense, that I don't see that there is a clear-cut distinction between what is symbolic and what is not symbolic. And that is what I think, what cognitive linguistics are suggesting with the idea. Okay? That is, at least, cognitive linguistics have this notion of symbolism. No? And then what you could say is, well, but that is not, that's not so in mathematics. Algebraic reasoning is, of course, not that. And then I tell you, well, you know, Landy and Goldstone and so on suggest something that goes in this direction. Symbolic reasoning is constrained, no? And even they say, for example, at some point, that their work show that in mathematical reason, that all mathematical reason is full of cognitive illusions. And they basically have this idea, no? They are, at least, you know, their work, no, point in this direction. And the thing is that once we have the thesis that there is not a clear-cut distinction between symbolic reason and non-symbolic reasoning, no? In a sense, also we can then extend the evolutionary model that explains the origin of grammar to an evolutionary model that explains the origin of the normativity associated with habits as rational tools, also tools of rationality.
So I've got a question about, in a sense, that slide here where you said that habits of reasoning are norms of good reasoning. And first, I'm not quite sure exactly what that means. As an interpretation that makes the most sense for me anyway, is that the norms of good reasoning are norms about what habit of reasoning we should be acquiring. You know, so
where is that?
it's a third line. It's habits of reasoning are not only constraints, but norms of good reasoning. So that, first, I'm not quite sure how to read that. The best reading I have in mind is that the norms of good reasoning are norms about which habits of reasoning we should be acquiring. Because that's a small, supposing it's the right reading of that sentence, then I'm not sure what's the relation between that view and cognitive linguistics. I mean, it's really two orthogonal questions. One can have a very similar view about what a norm of good reasoning is. It's maybe a norm about habit of reasoning, even if one believes that cognitive linguistics is just a terrible bit of science, right? After all, even if we have a model, an amodal way of thinking, symbols which are just not grounded in perceptual representations, supposing all that we're right, it could still be the case that norms of good reasoning are about acquiring the proper habits of reasoning.
Well, you see, yeah, that's it's hard to. I would say that it's hard to accept, and it's not easy to argue that. But that is what also Supes is saying about. Supes says that habits of reasoning are constraints that tell us what is good reasoning, and in that sense, let's say that habits of reasoning have in themselves a normative element that tells us what is good reasoning. That is. I mean, at least. Yeah. What my sense is?
Guess what you should be doing, you should acquire some specific habits,
Yeah.
The same way, if you're Aristotle, you think norms are about acquiring virtues, and virtues are by and large, as a first approximation, habits. But that I understand, but saying that habits themselves are normative strikes me as a categorical mistake. But I mean, I could see how you could.
Well, maybe just to put it concrete, so yesterday we heard a keynote lecture about obsessive compulsive disorder, right? And so you can think about them having very powerful habits of rumination, thinking again, I need to wash my hands, because otherwise, the world will end. So that would be some kind of habit, of reasoning about something. But surely it's not a norm for good reasoning. So even if you accept that there could be some normativity about the habits, that doesn't necessarily then entail that it would be a good normativity.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so
yes,
just a quick follow-up. So is it so that the habit himself has in its phenomenologies some kind of normative component that you experience the habit as having a normative nature? Oh, okay. I see.
Oh, yeah, I understand.
Should I make my question in English or in? But actually, my question was a bit like Eduard's. So I also don't understand what can it mean that habit is a norm of good reasoning, because it seems that when you say that there is a norm of reasoning, what you're saying is that it gives you some things with which you can evaluate reasoning, and you can say, this is a way of reasoning right, and this is a way of not reasoning right. And so habits, then you would have to have another norm to tell you which is a good habit and which is not a good habit. But then what does it solve? What does it explain? Why is this a better explanation than an explanation that does not suppose habits?
The thing is that, you see, habits, that's no, I see that's not simple, but what I'm trying to make is an explanation by analogy. How you explain the origin of gesture, and how you explain the origin of grammar as a kind of normativity associated with gesture. So that's a very general sense of norm that is not going to tell us what is good and what is bad.
Say something different, and I think, but I don't know if I'm understanding. And what you want to say is that habits are social, so there is a normative. So the normativity is in the social display of habits, actually, and then social. It's not like good reasoning. It's not in I don't know how to say this, but
something very important, that I really didn't say, is that habits are social. Let's say that the habits are like social gestures. That's a basic point in order to understand the kind of normativity that I am talking about. Mm-hmm. I figured.
I would like to ask you something too. Like, what would be for you the implication, like, of seeing a heuristic as habits? The implication if the rationality works. Like, what would you say? Like you know, all this literature that says that we are irrational, and like supported by Kahneman and Tversky, and the other literature like that one from Gigerenzer that it says that we are like rational. Like if we see like heuristics, not like competence like Kahneman and Tversky, or neither like toolbox like Gigerenzer, if we see it as habits, what would be the implication for the rationality books? What would you say?
I haven't thought about that, but might be interesting to see what can be. The implication of first of all, I have not a well articulated proposal of how to connect. I'm just suggesting that this opposition between two different ways of understanding heuristic reasoning is suspicious, and that we have to think twice whether there is not something more basic about what is reasoning, and that ultimately this discussion between this back and forth between Kahneman, Tversky, and Gigerenzer is not as important as they claim, say, in terms of our desire of understanding what is reasoning. And that because both reasoning is a tool and reasoning is a competence. And so we have to come to a way of saying how it can be a tool and a competence. That is basically. But I have not developed that. It's like well enough to elaborate in the direction of your question.
In your title, you talk about basic cognitive technology. So
I forgot about that. Yeah. Actually, no. Right. The thing is that I was going to talk about. Actually, I was going to say to make an even more complicated trip. Actually, I have talked about the idea of basic cognitive technology following the idea of basic mind of Puto and other people, and the importance of thinking of reasoning as basic technology. And this idea also can be connected with, let's say, let's say to an evolutionary explanation of basic cognition using a similar approach.
So even here in your conclusion, you talk about tools of reasoning, right? So there's the metaphor of technology here.
Exactly.
So
that was the connection. The thing is that I was going to say at the beginning that I am not going to talk about this first part of the paper, but I forgot to say.
Okay, well then maybe I can ask you about it now. So if we do accept this analogy or this link between tools that we normally understand, like stone tools, for example, and tools of reasoning, in your mind, is there a relationship between the two? Do we find markers in the actual stone tools that relate or tell us something about the tools of reasoning that they were possessing? And in your mind,
there are some work pointing in this direction.
So for you, then, when was the origins of reasoning? If you look at the stone tool record,
I think it's a co-evolution of several processes that involve the development of tool making, tool use, and tool learning. How we learn to recognize what the other is doing, paying attention to what the other is doing. But there is some quite interesting work on this direction, making this connection. And that connects with the idea of tools of reasoning as basic technology. Ultimately, what I'm interested in is an evolutionary explanation of this sort of account of these processes that ultimately converge in our development of reasoning capacities, but that originally are different or can be taught as different processes. Our use of tools, the domestication of animals and plants, that are related in a way. That somehow it seems that they were in the hominid lineage. There was a co-evolution of the development of these capacities, and that helped us to explain the sense in which reasoning is a tool.
Is there any other question? Well, thank you very much. Sergio. Ready? Are you ready? Yeah. Okay. Okay, we're going to start again. The next talk is Ángeles, Eraña and Axel Barceló from the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. And the name of the talk, as you can see, oh no, it changed a little, no? It changed a little. Well, the title is The Rationality of Delusions.
That is the title. And this is what we're going to argue. We're going to try to answer the question whether delusions have epistemic value. And of course, you may imagine that our answer is going to be yes, and that's going to be fun. Yes, so what is the idea? The idea is that we're going to talk about delusions. This is the plan of the short talk today. First, we are going to spell out some common assumptions regarding delusions, in particular that they are a kind of belief, and then we are going to we're going to assume that they are beliefs. I mean, I know it's a common assumption, but it's also controversial, so we're not going to say anything about that. But we are going to work on that assumption to the conclusion that they are rational, or that they have at least some epistemic value. And our argument is very simple. It's just that they aim to recover at least some of the thematic cognitive abilities that are fundamental for human rationality. That's a very short argument. If you know about delusions, you can more or less see how this is going to work out. So first of all, we don't know how to say delusions in Spanish, actually. Oh, she does know. I didn't know. Delirios. Entonces vamos a hablar de delirios. I don't know if I should talk in Spanish, in English. Okay, so yeah, I'll speak in English. Exactly. Eso lo puedo decir en español porque está ahí en inglés. You can read it, at least this part. Okay. Sí, entonces, please, would you be so kind to read it instead of, thank you. Entonces, pues sí, la visión tradicional es que los delirios son irracionales, ¿no? Si vemos la manera en que se caracterizan tradicionalmente, por ejemplo, en el DSMR, pues los delirios han sido tradicionalmente concebidos como creencias falsas, fijas, que tenemos con una convicción total y que son impermeables a la razón. Es decir, nosotros podemos tener muchas razones en contra de este tipo de creencias, y si estamos presos de este tipo de delirios, por supuesto que no vamos a cambiar de opinión, ¿no? Son creencias muy, muy, muy fijas. Entonces, es normal pensar que si eso es lo que es un delirio, suena muy, muy irracional, ¿no? Es difícil ver cómo podría tener esto valor epistémico. And in English. Okay, so yeah. So the traditional views that since delusions are fixed false belief held with absolute conviction and not amenable to reasons, that sounds pretty bad, right? That sounds like not rational at all, because they're false and not amenable to reason. I mean, there should be enough reason to say that they are not rational. And if they are beliefs, these are the features that commonly are held to be constitutive of the rational aspect of belief. So it violates the fundamental conditions for rationality. This is the traditional view, and of course we are here to say that it's wrong, of course, because mostly because we think that the main mistake, if we wanted to call it that way, on this traditional view of delusions is that it focuses on delusions as a kind of a what instead of a how, instead of a cognitive process, right? Delusions are, we think that the better way to understand the epistemic role or the epistemic value, the rational aspects of delusion, is by focusing on how we come to have delusions. So what is, when happens, why does it happen? To see it not just as the final resulting belief, but and what role it plays in our cognitive life. That's our approach. So yeah, so how do delusions happen? Of course, even though there's a lot of empirical research, it's still kind of messy. But I think we can still reach enough of a consensus that I think we have reached, or psychologists have reached enough of a consensus that delusions happens commonly in cases of brain damage, perception failure, reasoning biases, and cognitive deficit that sometimes trigger very, very high levels of anxiety, right? There is something goes wrong in our cognitive apparatus for any of these causes, and this triggers just overwhelming anxiety. This anxiety is really, really debilitating. It's by itself, it could just leave us numb, so please next, because it literally crashes our unconscious predictive mechanism because we get an excess of predictive errors in our cognitive systems. So these automatic cognitive mechanisms just stop working, right? They get overwhelmed by this anxiety, but our system just doesn't collapse. Right? It just cannot just say, well, sorry, end of us. But actually, there's the control mechanisms are recruited to take over, right? Because the automatic mechanisms are overwhelmed by this anxiety. The control ones are recruited to take over some of the work that is commonly done automatically by the automatic cognitive mechanisms, and this allows for operationality to be recovered, right? So the automatic systems are overwhelmed by this anxiety. By themselves, they're just not going to go out of these vicious loops, and so some control mechanisms that are usually used for, well, you know, what we use our control mechanism for, reasoning and things like that, are instead recruited to play some of the functions that are traditionally done by the automatic mechanism, and this allows the automatic mechanisms kind of to reboot and keep doing the things that they usually do, right? Okay, so the idea is that delusions are formed to stop this disabling anxiety, but not in a fully functional way, right? It's not that they just by magic return us to previous state, cognitive states, because the anxiety stopping beliefs create this function of its own, because the way they recover some of the functions of take over some of the functions of the automatic mechanism is to take these anxious thoughts and turn them into conscious thoughts. And these are the delusional beliefs, right? These fixed, false beliefs held with absolute convictions and not amenable to reasons are just the result of the non-automatic, the control mechanisms having taken over from the automatic mechanism, right? Yeah. So yeah, that's bad. But it has a very good outcome. It actually presents a very overall important advantage to our cognitive systems because it recovers the operationality of our automatic cognitive mechanisms, so that automatic cognitive mechanisms can do what they do well, what they are supposed to be doing. So our argument is that even though there is that price to pay for this recovery, the importance of recovering the operationality of these automatic cognitive mechanisms is so important that it is worth it. And so the overall balance from the rational point of view is going to be positive. That's more or less our argument. The idea is that it's a good deal, right? We are trading our automatic mechanism for control one. So before the delusion mechanism comes operation, the automatic mechanisms are malfunctioning, right? They are disabling. They are in these horrible, anxious loops. Automatic mechanism come, take over. They, of course, pick up the damage. But at least we can get back our automatic mechanisms. So this is a good trade because actually we're trading good for better. Next one. Because we get back the most epistemically valuable mechanism, and what we pay for recovering this mechanism are these other mechanisms that are important, of course, but they're not as important, right? We trade our control mechanism, our conscious mechanisms, in exchange for these other less valuable. No, we trade the less valuable for the high valuable ones, and that gives us an epistemic value deficit that is positive. The idea is that if we think of delusions, again, more as a mechanism than as just thinking of the output. Because the output, yeah, it's bad, right? It's bad to have, it's horrible to have these false beliefs, not amenable to reason. But if we look more closely as to why we end up having these beliefs, then we get to say that it was a good thing, right? We got a good deal out of the situation. We were in a situation that was completely debilitating. It was really bad because the most important cognitive mechanisms we have, which are the automatic ones, were being, were just malfunctioning in a very severe way, and we trade them for the malfunctioning of the conscious one. So we trade these false beliefs for the functionality of the automatic one. And since the automatic ones are more epistemically valuable than the control ones, then this trade-off has a positive cognitive and epistemic deficit. So this is what we think is happening. And now, in what sense is this rational, right? Because rationality is said in many ways. I don't need to tell you this. You're here probably because you know this. Rationality it can be cashed out in many, many, many ways. But I think that there is an important sense, there is a very substantial sense in which this is rational. Next one. And this is not going to be rational in the reliability externalist sense. Yeah, from that perspective, this is not rational. Also not going to be rational in the deontological internalist sense. Yeah, this is bad, really bad. But we think that there is a third sense that is actually even more fundamental, which is the adaptive sense, in which this is rational. Okay? This is clearly not, delusions are clearly not rational from an externalist point of view because they are not the result of being formed by a reliable mechanism. At least not by a not malfunctioning reliable mechanism, because actually the mechanisms that are involved, the automatic mechanisms that are involved, and both the control and the automatic mechanisms that are involved are reliable mechanisms, are rational mechanisms. But the problem is that malfunctions seem to be involved. At least the current research is that what triggers delusions are malfunctions, what did I say? Delusions. Okay, delusions. What triggers delusions are malfunctions of our mechanisms. So from a reliabilist point of view, this is not what the definition of a rational output would be, which is the output of a malfunction, of a non-malfunctioning reliable mechanism. So since malfunctions are involved, this is not going to satisfy the externalist criteria for rationality. And it's also not going to work if you're an internalist. If you're an internalist about rationality, this is also going to be bad because our delusional beliefs do not satisfy our epistemic duties, right? I already mentioned this several times. These are false beliefs commonly. These are fixed beliefs. These are held with absolute conviction without being amenable to reasons. This is all bad from an internal point of view, right? This doesn't fulfill our epistemic duties. So this is bad, definitely. That's not surprising. Please, the next. However, we think that this is there's a further sense of rationality, which is probably more fundamental for some of the reasons that Sergio already mentioned, that has to do with the effects and functions of the delusions, right? Once we stop thinking of delusions as states, as beliefs, but more as something that happens for reasons and also happens with some effects and because of something has that function, then that's when rationality emerges. That's when we can see the rationality of delusions, when we notice that it has these positive effects and it has also a positive function, which is to recover our automatic cognitive abilities, which is to recover our most important. And important here means epistemically valuable. And this is epistemically valuable according to both reliabilist and internalist. Well, mostly external, but from our more traditional senses of rationality, right? Because the first two senses of rationalities are actually sustained on top on these epistemically valuable automatic cognitive abilities. So if we recover that, we're actually getting a very good epistemic value out of delusions. So the idea is that delusions are adaptive in this strong rationality sense because they increase the epistemic status of the agent, right? And we think that is the question we should ask when we're asking of something, of a process, of a mechanism, whether it is rational. And so we think that the question about a certain kind of process as delusions are, about whether they are rational, is to ask whether they increase the epistemic status of the agent, right? It is not to say, oh, you know, a person with a delusion is in a very bad epistemic state. Yeah, we know that. It's horrible. But the question is whether having the delusion actually was good for the agent as an epistemic agent. And here we think that the answer is yes, right? Why are delusions rational? Because they improve the epistemic status of the agent. So we should not ask whether the status of delusional person is bad, just in the absolute sense, but whether it is better on how that person would be without the delusion. And the thing is that we just saw, if we look at the psychological data, that the status, the epistemic status of the person before the delusion is really, really bad, right? Their automatic systems are malfunctioning in a very, very debilitating sense, in a very cognitively and therefore epistemically debilitating sense. So the delusion improves on the situation. So you still end up in a very bad situation, but it's a much, much better situation than you would be without the delusion. And I think under those criteria, I think it's clear that delusions are epistemically valuable. They trade more epistemically valuable abilities for less valuable ones. Since our automatic capacities and mechanisms are of such fundamental value from an epistemic point of view, recovering them is so valuable that the sacrifice we do of our capacity of having some of our most closely held beliefs being amenable to evidence, yeah, that's bad, but it's a good price. It's a fair price to pay for recovering our most epistemically valuable abilities. Ergo, and conclusion, and this is very short, delusions are epistemically valuable. We get more bang for our buck. We trade the more for the less, right? It's still a trade-off. So there's still, of course, bad epistemic stuff happening. There's still irrational. These are still irrational beliefs if we want to look isolatedly at the resulting belief. But if we look at delusions, again, as processes, the last slide. So if we look at delusions as we think they should be looked at, as something that happens with certain effects, with certain functions, in a very certain given set of circumstances, then a picture of rationality emerges. Thank you.
So I do worry there's a slight equivocation on the notion of epistemic value. So on the one hand, something is epistemic valuable if it can be assessed by means of the norms or by means of epistemic norms, but that's not what's at stake here. On the other hand, something is epistemically valuable if it brings about something that has an epistemic nature. That's what's at stake here, right? So delusions, you're not assessing them or the process. You're not assessing the process by means of epistemic norms. You're saying it's epistemically valuable because it brings about something which has an epistemic nature, right? But let me just give you another example. So let's suppose I'm very anxious, and as I am, and let's suppose my best way to stop being anxious is to drink, as I do, and I drink quite a lot, and when I drink, after my second bottle, I feel much better, my anxiety goes down. Well, drinking is epistemically valuable by your light, because somehow my cognition works much better after. Well, it's exactly the same thing. It's exactly. Okay.
Drinking doesn't. What the thing that is we were trying to underline here is that what happens with the delusion is that your cognitive automatic mechanisms can work again, because what happens is that you get very reflexive when you're having this anxiety, and so you start thinking again and again, and then you have more anxiety and it just grows, right? So drinking does not make your cognitive mechanisms start working properly, and delusions do. So it's not the same kind of thing. And I don't think it's that what we're trying to show is only that this brings about the possibility of, but actually I think there is another point, and it is that there is a sense of being rational, which is very primitive and underlies the other two sentences, and it has to do with these automatic mechanisms working properly, not being like, how to say that, overloaded or whatever. And I don't know if this answers.
I think you're completely right that what we said so far is not enough. And I think that's what you're pointing out. There is something else about the way this mechanism gives us back something more of epistemic value, what we call epistemic value. And this is, I think Ángeles is completely right. It has to do with a strong, a claim that we only made on passing because, you know, it's more complicated than that, about why this mechanism of this what that we recover is more fundamental than the previous two senses of rationality. So actually, that is a very big premise of our work that we completely underdeveloped, right? But we do believe that given the adaptive nature of the mechanisms involved, there is a sense in which I don't know how to say it, how drinking has no adaptive value. So even, well, yeah, you're right, maybe it does. But no, but I mean, I guess that, but yeah, but then if it does, we would buy the ballot. I mean, if it's shown that it has the same kind of adaptive value for our regaining of our epistemic, then I would buy the ballot. Of course, yeah, there's no problem with that because we think that is doing a lot of the work.
Hi, thank you. Would you say that all kind of delusions are formed and can be explained the same way? Because at the beginning you said like the brain damage, perception failure, reasoning bias failure. But for example, would you say that, and also if they have the same function, for example, the illusions derived from schizophrenia and the illusions from psychedelics?
They are explained differently and they play different roles in our psychological lives, but I think that when you try to understand them from an epistemically point of view, it doesn't make really a difference because at the end, all delusions are characterized as false beliefs, fixed false beliefs, whatever, blah, blah, blah. So I know that the process of how you get there and, well, no, yeah, there are variations and it depends, but at the end I think that the result is the same, so we can just assume that all delusions are the same in this case.
Thanks for a really interesting talk. Two quick questions. One sort of following up on Edouard. It seems like the conclusion you want is that it's possible for delusions to have, or maybe even, you know, typically when delusions are caused in a certain way, they can have net epistemic benefits. Because again, it seems like you don't need drinking so suppose that I come up, I'm anxious, I come up with a delusion that I really will be successful as a swimsuit model. And I decide to change my life and I'm gonna throw myself into swimsuit modeling and
you're deluding then.
That's oh, totally deluded. And you know, you can imagine that the delusion itself leads to more anxiety, so if it's possible to come up with these examples in which there's no net benefit, then it seems like you want to weaken the conclusion just a little bit and say either it's possible or typically or something like that. Yeah. The second point I want to make is, okay, so I buy that there are certainly cases in which delusions bring net epistemic benefits. So let's agree on that. Doesn't follow that it's rational, that delusions are rational, even in an adaptive sense, because there might be an alternative way to get rid of the anxiety, say it's the anxiety that's causing it, that doesn't bring as many costs and brings the same benefits. So if you think about, and I like the account of anxiety, right? That I think you were talking about how it leads to sort of this vicious cycle, right? You get anxious, and,
yep.
and there's various ways in which that happens. And there's some evidence suggesting that, you know, if you get people to reinterpret what's making them anxious, at least sometimes it can make the anxiety go away. So a bit of cognitive behavioral therapy. So let's suppose that that in the cases where we agree that epistemic delusions bring a net benefit, it might be that an alternative way of getting rid of the anxiety would bring an even greater net epistemic benefit.
So what you're suggesting is that the conclusion that they are rational is not granted, since there can be some other ways which are not rational of having the benefits without the costs, and you wouldn't call that being like rational procedures or something like that. Yeah, okay. Yes, I think that there are some assumptions that we're making and that are not clear, and one of them is that, and it's what Axel was saying, that rationality has to do with adaptiveness, and I'm not sure. We would have to think about that a lot more. But if that is also, if that makes your adaptiveness be better, I don't know how to even spell this, then we would say that that is also a rational way of proceeding. So, yeah. But what I want to say is that regarding the first point is that yes, we can weaken the thesis, but there's a motivation, and I think that delusions are like the extreme in a line where you can start with wishful thinking and all these kind of things that are typically called irrational. And what we want is for all those to have to be explained differently and to be able to show that they have some kind of epistemic value, because if not, there is no way to explain some other evidence, like the resistance to evidence, when our beliefs are resistant to evidence and that kind of thing. So that's how we got here. And so, yes, probably when we talk about delusions, we can weaken the thesis, but as we move to the other side of the line, we can make it stronger or something like that.
Can you say a little bit more about how it happens that when you acquire a false belief that is with absolute conviction, not amenable to reason, leads to the recovery of your other functions? You seem to think it is obvious, but please explain, because
well, what seems to be happening, and I will try to explain, but I don't know if I will be able to do it very clearly, but what seems to happen is that when you start getting anxious because you are having, well, there are different theories, but you have these thoughts and they make you very anxious because they tell you things that control things about yourself or about the world or about, so what happens is that and you cannot explain anything, and you start predicting, having errors predicting things that will happen or your action. So those errors are what are supposed to be doing the overload of the cognitive basic cognitive mechanisms. So the control mechanisms take those functions, and what happens is that when the delusion is created, it's a false belief, but it helps you explain many things that are happening. So it's a false belief, but it calms you down because now you have an explanation of why are you hearing all these voices, and you can like, and that seems to, well, what people say, well, what authors say is that that's what makes your basic cognitive mechanisms work again normally, because all the overload is gone away. I don't know if I'm explaining this very well, but that's sort of the idea.
Very interesting topic. Congratulations. My question would be, if are there automatic systems per se, or to what extent you are assuming that they are fixed? To the, in the sense that sometimes adaptiveness has to be more related to changing that delusions and adapting them to some context. So it's kind of counterintuitive to do both assumptions.
But what is fixed? What your question is whether the mechanisms are fixed or whether...
No, you were talking about automatic systems? So
Yes.
to what extent you're assuming that those adaptive systems are fixed if in many cases, the more adaptive behavior is to treat them as, well, try to change in those delusions. Maybe I can say it clearer. You're saying that delusions are epistemically adaptive, but you might need to do the distinction between, you have to distinguish when those systems, when you realize that those delusions can be avoided and when you don't have to avoid them. I mean, some of them are automatically, you can realize them like in a more internalized fashion, and sometimes you don't have to realize that. So maybe you could distinguish some specific cases, because I'm sure that your distinction or your claiming should be applied to very, very nicely to some cases or some cases of delusions, but not to some others.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. Yes. I think it's a fair point. And yes, probably we should take a closer look to the fine-grained differences between different kinds of delusions. And probably that will make this false, but it's fun anyway.
Thank you very much. Okay, our next speaker is Ana Laura Fonseca Patrón. The name of her talk is Razonamiento heurístico como modos de respuesta al ambiente que son producto de la interacción social.
I don't know. Now working? Okay, thank you. I will try to do it in English because I know that there are some people that are not Spanish speakers, but my English is not very good, so I'm just trying to understand it. And if it's really bad, just tell me and I can switch to Spanish. So. Well, yes, I will try to motivate the idea that heuristic reasoning can be understood as a kind of answer to the environment, and the important future that I want to show here, or to motivate that those answers are a response to, are acquired by the social interaction. So I have a very long presentation, so maybe not a very good idea doing English, but well. There are two important problems in heuristic reasoning as is understood in cognitive psychology. And not the only ones, but I think just two important problems, and one of those is how to explain the automaticity, or that the answer that we give in some problems are very automatic or non-reflective, so that we only bring the answer. And the second one is that what is the relation between that kind of answer or the strategies that we use to bring those answers with rationality. So I think that the two most important proposals of heuristic reasoning that are heuristic and basis approach or tradition, and ecological rationality of Conferencia and ABC group, both of them try to explain in some way these two questions. And I will refer only to the ecological rationality in very quick way, just to try to show how they try to answer to this question. And well, and the reason why I will choose to do it just with the ecological rationality is obviously because of time, but also because I like more the answer to the second question in the case of ecological rationality than in the case of heuristic, basic, the tradition of heuristic and bias. And well, the first answer, the answer of ecological rationality to the first question is that we bring some answer very automatically because we have a toolbox, adaptive toolbox in our mind. So they say that they start with the premise that a lot of our reasoning in general it can be modeled with heuristics that are fast and frugal. And they say all those heuristics are in a adaptive toolbox. And this heuristic in the toolbox are modeled by them, and they try to find which are that heuristic that we have in our toolbox. So that is part of their descriptive model of how our brain works, or in this kind of cases in which we bring some automatic answers. And the second answer to this, the answer to the second question is that we can, we have to consider that sometimes that answers that are automatic and that we bring very quickly are actually good answers. So that we can find some kind of rationality in that strategy. And in this case, what is important in their project is that the criteria to evaluate the rationality of that strategies is not a logical criteria, but a correlative criteria or a ecological criteria, which mainly refers to precision, frugality, and speediness. So that means that they try to make a relation between the structure of the strategy that we use, or the heuristic that we use, with the strategy, the informational strategy in the environment. And if they match properly, so they think that this this is a successful heuristic or a successful strategy, and in that case it will be normative. And we can understand this claim, or the kind of prescription that they made with from this proposal is that if our problem is X, and we have in conditions, in certain environmental conditions, so we have to employ some particular heuristic. So this is the kind of prescription that this rationality will. And I think that this proposal has some problems. I don't going to explain extensively. I just going to mention as a motivation of what I want to do. And the first problem in the case of the answer, descriptive answer, why we have some answer, we can bring some answer very quickly and in an automatic way. It is that we can think that not all, there is not sure, or we can question if the models that they present, actually they are representations of what we are doing or what is in our mind. And that is I think that is implicit, it is an assumption in the project that the models that they are bringing are models that are in our minds. They have some kind of evidence that we can rely that models are what we are actually using. So I think that could be at least controversial. So, but the problems that are more interesting to me, and that also I think that are actually a biggest problem, are in the normative approach. And I think that one of those problems is they confuse, and this is a point that had made Stanovich and West very, very well, I think, is that they, the ecological rationality, if we try to relate very closely with a biological interpretation, we can understand two kinds of rationality involved in the proposal. One is an evolutive rationality. That means that a heuristic is successful when we are improving fitness, because that is like the measure of adaptiveness, and but that is not could not be related, has not to be related with the kind of ends that we have as individuals. And there is a problem. They have to try to distinguish clearly between an evolutive rationality and an individual rationality. I mean, and another problem is that they try to evaluate the successful of heuristics as a kind of instrumental rationality. And I think that when they try to do that, they inherited the problem of instrumental rationality, that is that they don't have a deliberation about ends and desires of individuals. And I was, 2 years ago, I presented something about that, so I don't want to see very much. But well, I think that it's, there are some reasons because this is problematic. But I think that also there are two motivations behind the ecological rationality that are very important. And I want to rescue that motivation, those motivations. So one is that heuristics are the result of the interaction with the environment. I think that is a very good or a very interesting motivation or claim. And the second one is that heuristics can be strategies that are actually adequate or in some context. And that it's important to, so that makes important to understand how heuristics work to understand human rationality in general. So what I try to, well, what I will try to do is just to motivate a way in which we can keep these two motivations with a different explanation of heuristics. And my proposal is, as in the title, as I said in the title, is that we can understand heuristic reasoning as a capacity that allows us to generate specific ways of act or of action, a kind of patterns or modes to answer to the environment. And the important part is that they are acquired by social interaction. And not only social interaction, but also with the interaction between agents and the environment. And I want to make an example. This is an example that is found in Jan Leib's work of cognition in practice. And I will use it in a little different way, but the example is the same. So she's an anthropologist, so they made a research with some kids in Brazil. So they asked a 12-year-old kid who was selling coconut. Thank you. And the client or the shopper, but who is a person who is making actually an interview, or well, who is someone who is conducting the study, asked to the kid if what is the cost of the coconut. The kid says that 35 reales, I don't know. And the client says that he wants 10 coconuts. And asks to the kid which is the total amount that he has to pay. And the kid actually answered, well, was thinking that, well, for 3 coconuts will be 105, with 3 more will be 210, make a pause, and later he said, I need 4 more, so there are 350, and so I think the total amount is 350. So what I want to try to show here is that the kid is using a pattern of action to solve the problem that he has. And he's actually decomposing the operation or putting the question in a different, easier problem. And we can think obviously that is not the best way to do this operation because it's very easy to just to add a 0. So because it is the quantity that the client wants are 10. And but what I want to notice here is that the boy is using a pattern that is usual for him. So it's used to make count in that way. So he makes that count very automatic. He don't stop to think, how do I have to do this operation? He just starts to do it. Oh, I'm really, really out of time. But well. And what I want to motivate is that in the understanding patterns of heuristics as pattern of actions, we can explain the automaticity, because once we acquire some pattern of actions, we can use it very quickly. We don't stop to think what pattern we have to use, we just use it. And this is because this is related with the way in which we learn those patterns. If we learn by imitation, not in a very deliberated way, but just imitating others. So we can use it in that way. Just we find the circumstance in which that pattern is triggered, and so we use it. And in this sense, we also can understand that those patterns can be shared, because we acquired from others, and in that sense, that means that others have also that pattern. And this is something maybe we can understand why some answers in cognitive psychology are systematic between a lot of people. Well, and here I want to say that one of the things that Gigerenzer want to explain with the hypothesis of the adaptive toolbox is that we all have the same heuristic, because there are they came with us in a biological sense. There are adaptations that we all have, so that is why are the same for more or less all of us. And another way to try to explain that is that say, well, in different contexts we can use it, and we can share it because we learn it from others, and we don't have to try to make a relation with why they are, if they are biological or not. And well, also we can see in cognitive literature that heuristics are difficult to modify. There is a project, I think that all Kahneman and Gigerenzer, both of them, have a project on how to improve reasoning. But in both cases, the improvement doesn't mean that you're going to change heuristics, but that you're going to change, in the case of Gigerenzer, you're going to change the environment, but not the heuristic. Maybe what you're going to change is the use of which heuristic you're going to use in which case, because the heuristics are successful for in some cases, and in another not. So they don't try to change the heuristic, but the way or which heuristic we use in each case. But I think that a more interesting way to try to understand or to try to change or improve our reasoning in general is to understand how actually our heuristics change. And we can try to understand that if we think that those heuristics are acquired socially. Because when we, for example, we use it in a very automatic way, and until we find a situation in which it can be used. So something happens that the heuristic stops working. And in that case, we can just make a deliberation of what has happened that the heuristic is not working in this case. And this process that is conscious can lead to a change in the heuristic. Not maybe necessarily directly to in the heuristic to change the way we the pattern directly, the pattern that we are using, but to change the way in we are approaching in general the situation, or to try to change something in the environment to later try to modify the pattern. But I think that this is a way in which we actually can try to explain how heuristic modifies. Not just that we have to use another heuristic for this case, but that how I can modify this heuristic and bring another pattern that could be more successful. And finally, I'm going to say something about the evaluation that is very important for me. But I very aware that all this is like very general, and all this time, should be thought in a more deep and in a more deep way, or deeper. And but I just want to motivate the idea that this is something that can be done. And what I want to say about the evaluation is that when we think in patterns of action, we can say that those patterns are good or are bad. So there is room for talk about normativity of those patterns, and to say, to try to evaluate in which cases those patterns work properly and in which doesn't. This evaluation implies a deliberative process to find a new pattern of action that allows that the activity that was disrupted could continue in a proper way. So I think that if we think in heuristic in this way, we can we have to think in norms in a different way as we are used in the cognitive psychology, as Giger said, and also as Kahneman does. I think that we can think in norms as just mode, some mode of actions that are approved by socially approved. I mean, there is a community that have to approve that pattern is a good pattern. And well, obviously there is a lot to develop here, but that is like the general idea. And I think that in this way we avoid the conflict. Obviously, the conflict that Giger has with the evolutive rationality and instrumental rationality, and also the problem to make a room for the deliberation about not only about the means that are better to reach some goal, but also to deliberate about those ends. And well, just to conclude, I will just to conclude, last slide. Some difference that I think are important, and is the origin of the pattern of action are not the product of adaptation to the environment by natural selection, as Giger does, or Giger believes, but are acquired socially. And the proposal is to study how we get those patterns and how we modify them. So I think that is something really interesting, and that has to do with understand how is related our biological part, because obviously I'm not saying that the biological part has nothing to do, but how that biological part is related with the social part, and with also with the material culture, or I mean with the resources, material resources that we have that we dispose to make some reasoning. And something that is important for me, to me, is to try to understand that we don't have to study those patterns as to try to find a list of which are the patterns that are good or which are the patterns that are bad, but to try to understand how it works when patterns goes well and how it works when they don't. So.
Thank you very much. There are some minutes for questions, probably.
I'm not entirely sure I understood the part about, so we don't need to, so how are we going to evaluate the patterns of reasoning on your view? I'm not clear about that. So can you just tell me again?
What I am thinking is that maybe we can evaluate those patterns trying to relate to how we socially understand that something is properly done. And that means that there is not like a, like a way to say in every case that this is well done and this is bad done. So there is like a socially distributed kind of norms, and that is why I try to say. Obviously, it's not very detailed. But
so one worry I have about that is the same sort of worry I have about pragmatism. So if you just so here's roughly the worry. Let's take let's suppose we have I can give you one of two pills. Okay? One pill will make you reason accurately about things, and the other pill will make you reason accurately about things except when you're sick. And it turns out that there's some evidence that when you're sick, if you're overly optimistic about your chances to improve, you'll do better. Okay, so that is, you're more likely to improve. But it might be the case that in some circumstances you want to be more pessimistic. So, so there's a third pill. It makes you more pessimistic because, look, if you get a diagnosis that says, like, you might have this disease, maybe it's actually better from a pragmatic perspective for you to be really worried, because then you'll take action. So here's the thing: if you just think, look, let's just worry about accuracy, then it's easy. I can tell you how to reason. But if you worry about what's in your best interest or what society thinks is in their best interest, it's just a lot harder to see how to give good advice about how to use these patterns of reasoning that isn't just, well, it depends on the situation how you ought to reason. It's just hard to see how you can give general advice other than just, well, do the best you can in a particular situation that you're in.
yeah, obviously, well, if I understood, obviously, we want to say also that we want to keep some accuracy criteria of the criterion of evaluation. But I think that one thing that we can say maybe is that there is obviously some cases in which it will be very difficult to say if some pattern is accurate or not. But in general, I think that when we say that the criteria is like distributed socially, we not only want to say that everything that we can like to make is not just a convention. I mean, it is not just a social convention, because there are a lot of things that doesn't work. I mean, the world makes us to see that doesn't work. And in that sense, I think that we can trust that some patterns will be accurate and another doesn't. And maybe which is difficult, is that maybe it's not something that we can tell in the right moment. Maybe it's something that we're going to realize later, because sometimes we can't just say in that time if the answer is right or is wrong. So maybe it takes some time to say that wasn't the right answer, that wasn't the right pattern, because the world shows us that doesn't work. So I think that there is a way in which we can, or at least I have like this now, this commitment with think that that the fact that we rely on the social distribution of norms doesn't mean that are just conventional and everything can be done if some people make an agreement that that is a good norm. So that is why.
Last question.
So my question is a very general one, and I'm just trying to see where you want to go. So you were saying that it is very important to understand how heuristics change, and so you gave us a story of how they do. But I still don't know why it's important and what it helps you. Once you understand that, what are you going to be able to explain with that?
Yeah, for example, innovation or creativity. I mean, I think that sometimes when we find a new problem, we have to rely on some heuristics or some strategies that you used in the past, but they're not exactly the same. It is not exactly the same problem that we faced before. So we have to change a little bit of what we're going to face that problem. And for example, if you think in the project of Conferencia, they will say, well, you have to use another heuristic because if the structure of the problem is different, so you have to rely on another heuristic that match with that structure. But I think that that's like, that has some problems. I mean, first of all, you have to recognize which heuristic match with that kind. You have to recognize the structure of the problem, and you have to find which heuristic is going to match well with that structure. So I think that it could be really interesting to understand how heuristics develop, or how some heuristic can change, and how we can, just to understand how we solve some problems which are new problems for us, but that maybe are related in some way with the problems that we solved in the past in some way. So that to see how some pattern that we used in the past, we can use it slightly modified in the future. It's not exactly like the same pattern, but that allows to make some improvement. Or to understand creativity. I think that the way in which we can like think in new ideas is related with some ideas that we had in the past. So I think that is why it's important.
Well, thank you very much. Well, our next speaker is Mariana Salcedo. She's a PhD student at the Universidad Nacional, Autónoma de México. And the name of her talk is ¿Qué podría contar como un buen candidato? Que lo cambiaste, ¿no? ¿Qué podría contar como un buen candidato a clase natural en la psiquiatría?
Okay, I am not quite sure if I must to speak in English because I am not very good with the language, but I'm going to try in order that all people understand me. Then the idea of this talk is try to answer if there is good candidates in psychiatry to be natural kinds. I am working with this idea some time ago, and 3 months ago I went to a workshop about practices of individuation and classification in biological science. At that point, I was not very sure if it was a good idea to talk about natural kinds in psychiatry, but in that workshop I realized that not only in psychiatry, but in biological science, is very, very difficult. There is a big problem to individuate mechanisms and to individuate natural kinds. And then I realized that maybe there are similarities between the kind of phenomena that are mental disorders and the kind of phenomena that are like species or genes or hurricanes or whatever other kinds of biological objects. Or then I'm going to try to answer this question. My objective, well, in first instance, is to try to answer if the research domain criteria that is a new project, not new, it's a project that has at least 10 years, more or less. That is a project whose object is to formulate a new classificatory systems in the psychiatry. If this research domain criteria has the resources, theoretical and methodological, to postulate good candidates to be natural kinds. But before to answer that, I want to review or to see what happens in other science like chemistry or biology, and to try to see what are the criteria that was like imposed from that discipline to the idea of natural kind. Then what counts as a good candidate for natural kind in chemistry and in biological science. Then, the paradigmatic examples in chemistry, or in general in the discussion of natural kinds, are the chemistry, la tabla de los elementos, the chemical composers, and like periodica, tabla periodica, do you know? Periodic table, yes. These both are like the paradigmatic examples from which people, when in philosophy, start to think what criteria or which criteria must to accomplish a good candidate for to be a natural kind. And when I refer to these three criteria, I am referring to the traditional or the classical conception of natural kind, like essentialist natural kind, and a realistic view about the natural kinds. That means that natural kinds reflect the causal structure of the world. Then, why these examples, or paradigmatic examples, are good candidates for to be natural kinds? There are at least three main criteria that these candidates accomplish. They must allow to do good inductive inference. What means that if we have an instance about, for example, water that has a molecular structure of H2O, do you understand me? That I can do good inductive inference about H2O because of the structural, the molecule of the H2O that implies that this molecule allows me to predict that, for example, water has the property of solubility, or that water has good thermic properties. And then all the time that I find this natural kind in the nature, always I can see that this kind has the same properties. Then the other criteria is that this natural kind can figure in universal laws. And the two criteria, natural kinds must reflect something about the causal structure of the world. In some sense, these two criteria are related. And the fact that these three criteria was accomplished means that natural kinds are always causally homogeneous. No, that is very important, at least in this classic view of natural kind. That the stability of the properties is also a good, an important characteristic, and then the uniformity of the instances. Always that we have an instance of the class, we have the same properties. We can make the same inference about that. Do you understand me? I'm okay. Not I think. This is only like a translation for me. That and I am trying to make a point about the uniformity of causality of the structural of the causal structure of the world. Then, at some point, people in philosophy and I suppose that in biology realize that this kind of criteria are not could not be accomplished for all the kind of phenomena. One of the controversial cases in biology is the notion of species. The problem with the biological species is that these classes of this category does accomplish fully the three criteria that I mentioned before. Maybe we can make a inductive inference, legitimate inductive inference, but this this kind of categories doesn't figure in general laws, and there is no causal uniformity. Or yes, do you understand? There is no homogeneity in the causal structure of this kind. But Millikan answered to this discussion, and she says that species, the kinds or the category of the species accomplish this criteria, but like in a more loosey way or in another way. And then she stated that that species allow to make a legitimate inference, but not based in the causal structure, in an homogeneous causal structure, but in the historical links between the different instances of the species. These categories figure figure in regularities, but not in universal regularities or universal laws, but other kind of regularities that could be ceteris paribus. And for the proper nature of this kind of categories, they are subject to changes in the causal mechanism. That means that as species are subject to evolution, then it's very for instance, as species are subject to evolution, then the causal structure of and the properties of the species a long time could change. Then there is no these candidates to natural kinds have some variability. Then, but Millikan are trying to argue that even when species could have this variability, even though they could be natural kinds. Then, in this sense, we can say that species could be considered to be a good a candidate for to be a natural kind, but in a context of more loosey or more expanded criteria, in which, for example, causal homogeneity is not like a criteria, or not in the sense that essentialists expect. Only this The reason why Millikan argue that species can be good natural kinds is because they can guarantee the stability of the properties among the members of the species about other kind of mechanisms, like the mechanism of reproduction. 5 minutes, no. Okay, my point is that in psychiatry, this was the main classificatory system in the last 30, 40 years. And some of the categories that people that in this context, most people could agree that could be a good natural kind are schizophrenia, autism, or depression. These are categories in the sense that they put together instances that share characteristics of some kind. The problem with these categories is that they are not, they overlap one between other, and the stability of every of these categories is variable, and this variation of stability could see in different ways that I have no time to explain. But the point is that they are very variable, that they overlap, and well, my conclusion for this is that they are not good candidates for natural kind. Even when they are more or less stable clinical objects, they are not natural kind. They not figure in universal laws, and they don't, the most important, they don't reflect any causal homogeneity. And this is why, one of the reasons why now the research domain criteria emerge in order to try to construct a better classificatory system of mental disorder. This is a project, a research project, which proposes to develop new ways of classification of mental disorders based in functional dimensions and neurobiological measures. They consider the approach a translational approach that search for translate the knowledge of basic science to the purposes of the clinic. And this strategy of investigation try to decompose different that they name like construct, functional constructs, and functional dimensions that are these five. When are five, I only put three functional dimensions that are the cognitive negative valence systems, positive valence systems, cognitive system, social processes, and the fifth is regulatory and excitatory system. The idea of the research domain criteria is to try to fill the information about the cell, the process of in the cells, molecules, circuits, but like the final purpose of the research domain criteria is try to classify mental disorders by the deficits in neural circuits. Then, why you are so? Okay. Then, one important difference with the DCM, research domain criteria try to classify disorders as not individual, try to classify these functions in the neural circuits. Even in the context of the classical conception of natural kinds, the research domain criteria, I think that they could accomplish a good classification of natural kind in the terms that the essentialist conception of natural kind. But why not? Because of the la necesidad, the necessity to have a causal homogeneity in natural kinds. Yeah. But there is another possibility. Well, 1 minute. Oh, sorry. You know this proposal? This proposal has, in some sense, has the same criteria that the classical proposal, but more loosely, trying to respect or to take into account the variability of geological systems. Then, definition of natural kinds as homeostatic property cluster is that they are conjuntos. Sets of properties contingentemente agrupadas that these co-occurrence between properties are explained by causal mechanism, and that this relation between, when they talk about homeostatic mechanism. I need to run. The problem with this notion of natural kinds, even when it's more loosey, and they try to give place to the variability, I think that even the reducta is trying to construct a system of classification taking into account the knowledge from basic science, even though it's impossible to try to accomplish the criteria that Boyd give up. Because today, psychiatry only have partial explanations about the neural mechanism of mental disorder. Then it's almost impossible to try to individuate, let me think how I put neural mechanism in order to see how to cut the mental phenomenon, the mental phenomena or the psychiatry phenomena. Then only my proposal or my suggestion is that if we want to satisfy the criteria of Boyd, maybe we need to think about another characterization of mechanism. Not necessarily causal mechanism, but to think about something that my advisor name, Claudia Garcia, systems, no, functional, that means I take into account also to Bechtel that distinguish about physical mechanism and mental mechanism in order to widen the notion of mechanism to disciplines in which the level in which we study the phenomena conlleva, how you say, results more transformation of, no, not only transformation of physical processes, but involves principally the process of information. Then my idea is on if in psychiatry we want to speak about or to try to answer if could be good candidates to be natural kinds. Maybe we can accomplish the criteria of causal mechanism, but we can to give an option in order to try to accomplish talking about like a functional mechanism to explain why the properties are, what the stability of the properties in a cluster, or I'm going to talk about like a cluster of cognitive dysfunction. How to explain the stability of that cluster, but appealing to the functional relations between that property, and not necessarily to the mechanism, causal mechanism that we haven't yet.
We have time just for 2 questions. So
Bueno, generalmente psiquiatría y psicología están en el SM4 y el CIE, ¿no? Ya van en el 10. Por lo que entendía, esta nueva forma de clasificar intenta generar una diferencia. Esto tendría efectos en la práctica clínica, entendiendo que una clasificación tiene que generar, o generalmente en el modelo médico, desemboca en no solamente en la categorización, sino en el diagnóstico, sino en el tratamiento. Entonces, al proponer esa nueva clasificación, esto tendría que tener diferencias en el tratamiento o no.
They are searching for better treatments, and they are searching for biomarkers, marcadores biológicos. ¿Se me fue la palabra? Biological markers. Yeah. And they think that if they find that, then there will be better ways to improve mental health, or even to prevent.
So I'd like to invite you to step back a little bit, and instead of looking at whether and in which sense psychiatric syndromes could be natural kinds, I'd like you to explain to me why we should think of them as kinds in the first. I'd like you to explain to me, or to explain why we should think of them as kinds in the first place. You know, another conception, you know, philosophers have been obsessed with kinds, with science, but it may just not be the right way of thinking about psychiatric disorders. You know, another way of thinking about them is just as the end of tails, of distributions in the population, right? So, and somebody who is depressed is somebody who is just extremely sad, for example, along a continuum of sadness, or something like that, for various syndromes, right? So, why is this focus on kinds in the first place?
I hope I understand your question. The idea of to talk in psychiatry about natural kinds, or to talk to, is that maybe the DCM, the problem with the DCM is that the categories that they postulate, a lot of them are not really mental disorders that in a dysfunctional sense. Then I am trying to suggest a criteria, dysfunctional criteria, in order to like a criteria of demarcation between like real mental disorder, another kind of condition that maybe are clinically relevant, but not necessarily dysfunctional in a biological sense. Then the reason why I am taking into account this proposal is in order to see if what kind of psychiatric objects are really have this like really resemblance, like a real mental illness. In English I can explain, but you can understand. Like to try to distinguish between real mental disorders and other kinds of disorder that are not necessarily must be treated with pharmacos, with psychopharmacos, for example. And in order, I am an anthropologist then, in order then to avoid the stigma of the hyper diagnosis to people. It's a simple question, answer.
Well, sorry, but we need to start with the next talk.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Well, our next speaker is Rubén Darío Jiménez. He's a PhD student of the National University. And the name of his talk is El carácter patogénico de los afectos en la constitución del cognitivismo clínico evolucionista.
Bueno, de entrada una disculpa para los visitantes extranjeros que no hablan español. Yo había preparado mi ponencia en español y sería más irresponsable si abuelo de pájaro la fuera yo traduciendo porque realmente no hablo muy bien inglés. Entonces, bueno, una disculpa de antemano. Esta ponencia se integra dentro de un trabajo histórico más amplio en el cual estoy explorando la conformación de la categoría de la confrontación entre racionalidad y emociones en el pensamiento evolucionista, particularmente dentro de las nuevas corrientes cognitivistas evolucionistas y particularmente dentro de la psiquiatría y la psicología clínica. En ese sentido, trataré de, me disculpo también de antemano porque mi exposición será un poco más tradicional. La primera parte sí expondré rápidamente algunas cuestiones sobre Darwin y lo demás lo tendré que leer. Bien, bueno, el plan es este, ¿no? Primero hablaré de emociones y psicopatología en Darwin, después la emergencia de la psicopatología evolucionista frente al problema de la afectividad y después explicaré esto del cognitivismo clínico evolucionista y cómo empieza a ver los afectos como patógenos. La categoría de cognitivismo clínico la tomo de un historiador italiano llamado Antonio Semerari, que se refiere precisamente a las posturas dentro de lo que con este afán bélico han llamado revolución cognitiva, para comprender los problemas mentales y tratarlos, ¿no? Bien, de entrada, bueno, un poco lo que me motivaba era la pregunta de por qué siempre que hablamos de la teoría de las emociones de Darwin, lo hacemos solamente de sus 3 principios explicativos de la expresión, los cuales ocupan una parte muy pequeña de este gran tratado de la expresión de las emociones en los animales y el hombre. Puede uno comprender el por qué. Darwin ahí se da muchísimas concesiones con respecto a sus interpretaciones del papel de las emociones, ¿no? Prácticamente me parece que su pensamiento discurre ahí en 2 vías. Una, que tendría que ver con el papel que tienen las emociones en la heredabilidad de las patologías, algo no muy explorado por los historiadores, ¿no? Y la segunda, que tiene que ver con como una especie de reivindicación del valor anamnésico, del valor clínico que podrían tener las expresiones a la hora del diagnóstico. Es decir, la expresión de las emociones sería una vía para el diagnóstico psiquiátrico, lo cual restaura, por así decirlo, la fisiognomía clásica y le da una especie de barniz evolucionista que empezó a darle cierta autoridad al pensamiento evolutivo temprano dentro del ámbito de la psiquiatría. Es decir, después de este artículo se logra concretar, después de este texto, una teoría propiamente naturalista de las enfermedades mentales que lograba, vamos a decirlo así, superar el desafío que el tratamiento moral inglés, bueno, aquí quiero hacer una puntualización. Desafortunadamente la historiografía de las ciencias humanas, particularmente la locura, ha estado dominada por historiadores francoparlantes, que con sus categorías nos han hecho entender mal, creo yo, la historia vamos a llamarlo así, a la Foucault, de la locura en Inglaterra. Y bueno, hay que entender que el problema de la locura en Inglaterra estaba tratado por esa época principalmente a través de la visión que habrían tenido los así llamados posteriormente, no estoy de acuerdo con ese nombre, los moralistas o los que ocupaban el tratamiento moral, que realmente son miembros de la Sociedad de los Amigos, la Sociedad Cristiana de los Amigos o los cuáqueros, quienes desde su antropología teológica, vamos a decirlo así, plantean una posibilidad de tratamiento a la locura, que desde la vía de entendimiento de la locura de Locke y de William Butt y de John Monroe, que había hecho escuela en Inglaterra, no se podía tratar. Es decir, las madhouses en Inglaterra no tenían la función de curar a locos, sino más bien de encerrarlo, hacerle sangrías, una serie de cuestiones un poco dantescas, pero es a partir de este texto que van a surgir figuras importantes, pero que van a anquilosar algunos debates. Me refiero a John Crichton Browne, el célebre psiquiatra evolucionista con el que debate Darwin en este texto, y a Henry Maudsley, a quien le debemos, por así decirlo, la teoría de la heredabilidad de las enfermedades mentales, y las emociones ahí tienen un papel. Bueno, de entrada, para Darwin las emociones no son, no corresponden a ninguna especie de entidad biológica, no son una clase natural, pues, un poco en línea con lo que decía Mariana, y que ha sido un debate importante dentro de la filosofía de la biología y de la filosofía de las ciencias cognitivas, si las emociones son clases naturales o no. Bueno, para Darwin no, de entrada hay que entender que el sentimiento no es más que fuerza nerviosa. Para entender esto, creo que también habría que entender otra cuestión. La introducción de este texto, tanto en inglés como en español, siempre ha hecho equivalente la idea de sensorio con la idea de glándula pituitaria, pineal, pero no es cierto. Realmente Darwin, cuando está hablando del sensorio, está hablando del circuito nervioso, de materia nerviosa, que se ve afectado o no por ciertas impresiones. En ese sentido, el sentimiento es fuerza nerviosa en movimiento, la cual tiene dos momentos. Un momento que es el momento perceptivo, que sería de afuera hacia adentro, y uno que es el momento expresivo, que sería la acción corpórea. Es decir, entonces una emoción para Darwin no es más que fuerza nerviosa más acción corpórea. Esto es importante, creo yo, que se resalte, porque lo que quiero exponer más adelante es que bueno, lo que quiero decir es que Darwin entra a este texto como un interaccionista, pero sale dándole pie a un localizacionismo duro, ¿no? Es decir, por su diálogo con Henry Maudsley y con Crichton Browne, sale aceptando que podría haber algo así como 2 o hasta 3 pisos de la cerebrales, que serían equivalentes a 2 o hasta 3 pisos de la mente, que serían equivalentes pues no solamente a las teorías románticas psicoanalíticas, sino pues a las teorías de la mente dual contemporáneas, que creo, y a las hoy ya menos célebres, pero no por eso menos influyentes, ideas de los 3 cerebros. Bueno, la acción corpórea es lo único que puede ser innato en Darwin. En ese sentido, la diferencia entre emociones básicas y emociones construidas o como constructos sociales no es operativa en Darwin. Y esto es importante porque dentro de la, vamos a llamarlo así, la apología que ha hecho Robert Plutchik y otros psicólogos evolucionistas de la teoría de las emociones de Darwin, se ha pensado que Darwin pensaba en las emociones como algo innato, y parece que no va por ahí, ¿no? Bien, decía yo la primera parte, ¿no? Que para Darwin es importante las emociones porque tienen una relación con la heredabilidad de las enfermedades mentales, y esto es por lo siguiente, pues Darwin no es muy darwinista ahí, y entonces para él el hábito genera una impronta en la materia nerviosa tal que se hereda generaciones tras generaciones y genera una especie de predisposición a adquirir enfermedades mentales, lo cual precisamente va a apoyar o va a darle fundamento al degeneracionismo en psiquiatría, del cual, bueno, algunos historiadores creen que, y yo concuerdo con ellos, ¿no? Todavía no salimos de ese degeneracionismo, ¿no? Bueno, el hábito tiene una función importante entonces porque es el que genera esta impronta en la fuerza nerviosa que después será heredada, y dado que del hábito depende la realización del instinto por la impronta en la materia nerviosa, también en los buenos hábitos estaría la vía para las expresiones adecuadas acordes con las etapas de la vida. Esto lo digo porque lo que surge de la teoría de las emociones de Darwin es esta visión bastante patética, quizá podríamos decir, en la cual el loco es una especie de salvaje. El loco es un salvaje, al igual que lo es el niño, la mujer, ¿no? Y los animales no domesticados. los animales domesticados estarían al nivel de los hombres blancos europeos victorianos, ¿no? En ese sentido, la teoría de las emociones de Darwin da pie a esta entrada. Bueno, esto me parece muy importante porque esta sería la primer parte de la teoría de las emociones y que creo yo que es la que se heredó a los debates cognitivos contemporáneos. Y estaría esta segunda parte, como sensor de salud y enfermedad mental. Bueno, quienes conozcan el texto recordarán la afición, el gran aprecio que tiene en este texto por los estudios de Duchenne de Boulogne. Y bueno, Duchenne de Boulogne tenía una idea bastante arriesgada, ¿no? Si las emociones tienen una expresión, y esta expresión es siempre la misma, si el camino es de ida, también podría ser de vuelta. Si yo genero la expresión, podría causar la emoción, y entonces hace estos estudios de galvanismo en los cuales aplica con 2 electrodos electricidad a varios puntos nerviosos para generar la emoción y saber si esto generaba el sentimiento subjetivo, ¿no? Pero todavía era más osado. Bueno, este es Boulogne, pero Darwin es más osado en su hipótesis. Lo que él dice es, la impronta no solo se da en la materia nerviosa, sino también en los gestos. Es decir, un gesto sostenido durante mucho tiempo deja marcas y los gestos están relacionados, ahí ya va la hipótesis principal, con emociones. Es decir, las emociones, la enfermedad mental puede caracterizarse como la preponderancia de una emoción y no de otra. Es decir, vamos a decirlo así, como una especie de perseverancia de una emoción que genera el abandono de otras expresiones. Y eso generaría una especie de ceguera tanto a los procesos racionales como a otros procesos. Bueno, esto es importante porque esta teoría como tal genera la teoría de las hiperemociones de Johnson Laird, que también, bueno, tiene una gran importancia en los estudios de racionalidad de la psicología cognitiva, de Peter Watson, y va a ser muy importante en la línea de lo que se ha llamado psicoevolucionismo, en la cual pues se encuentra el padre de la teoría de los 3 cerebros, Paul MacLean, y pues prácticamente con ellos lo que hoy en día se llaman las neurociencias afectivas de Jack Pansett, ¿no? Bien, hay un dato interesante aquí, ¿no? A pesar del repudio que se pueda hoy tener al psicoanálisis, como menciona Andrew School, hacia la década de los 60, el 80% de los médicos, de los psiquiatras norteamericanos eran psicoanalistas. Y un número similar, el 70% de los psicólogos clínicos habían tenido alguna formación psicoanalítica, lo cual a nivel histórico pues genera una suspicacia, porque uno podría decir, en 40 años por supuesto que no hemos podido abandonar los lastres de la teoría psicoanalítica, por más que en las interpretaciones filosóficas, en la discusión en filosofía de la mente, se quiera decir que estamos más allá, ¿no? Bueno, la cuestión es que esta idea de las hiperemociones ha llegado a nuestros días precisamente como una de las teorías más importantes para explicar los procesos de salud y enfermedad mental dentro de este cognitivismo clínico. Si bien se ha tratado o se le han cambiado los ropajes conceptuales, que la verdad es que las emociones siguen teniendo un papel bastante kantiano, ¿no? En esta dietética kantiana de que había que evitar la pasión para tener o cultivar ciertas virtudes de la razón. Y bueno, me parece que ha sido por esta reinterpretación de los principios darwinianos, a los que Darwin, claro, que daba pie, ¿no? Bueno, no sé, es que ya se me acabó el tiempo, pero pues es que es una exposición histórica, me habría gustado tener más tiempo, ¿no? Y dejo muy inconcluso esto, pero lo que estoy tratando de mostrar es cómo, vamos a decirlo así, en discusiones aparentemente ajenas de la psicopatología, está el correlato psicopatológico siempre ahí. Y en esto que se ha llamado epistemología de la afectividad, o en este nuevo giro en el que se habla de racionalidad, de las emociones, por alguna extraña razón, Ronald de Sousa, Amélie Rorty, siempre recurren al ejemplo de la psicopatología, como para validar sus argumentos. Entonces, bueno, a mí me surge esta duda, pues, de epistemología histórica a la Canguilhem, ¿no? De que, pues, no, si eso está tan presente ahí, supongo que tiene un fundamento histórico, y me parece que, bueno, pues más o menos lo estoy encontrando. Gracias.
Tenemos espacio para preguntas. Terminó antes de 20. Todavía podías hablar unos 2 minutos, pero bueno, tenemos espacio entonces.
Sí, yo tenía una pregunta con respecto a la visión evolucionista y los hábitos. Desde una perspectiva evolucionista se ve, digamos, una prolongación entre la racionalidad de los seres humanos y, digamos, la racionalidad de otros seres, en este caso animales, ¿no? Entonces yo quisiera saber si desde una perspectiva evolucionista también se cree que los hábitos son inherentes a los animales. Me gustaría saber si también hay este proceso de predisposición heredadas que los animales aprenden mediante un proceso de interacciones entre ellos, etcétera. Y desde esa perspectiva evolucionista, digamos, cómo se caracteriza la herencia de caracteres heredados.
Bueno, la pregunta, no sé si la pueda contestar, pero la voy a tratar de abordar históricamente. La noción de hábito en Darwin es bastante, vamos a decirlo así, perdón por este anacronismo, es bastante lamarckiana. Para él el hábito va de ida y vuelta, es decir, el hábito va generando la pauta de heredabilidad de comportamiento que no sería por otra vía. No obstante, en el caso de la psicología, particularmente en las lecturas del funcionalismo temprano, particularmente con John Dewey, la noción de hábito pierde ese anclaje lamarckiano para convertirse pues, en el caso de Dewey particularmente, en una pauta de interacción entre lo social y lo biológico, pero que no necesariamente tenía factores evolutivos. Me parece que es hasta el surgimiento o más o menos en la época, está esta discusión cuando empieza a tener impacto en otras áreas de la psicología la nueva síntesis de Huxley, que me parece que ahí se da una omisión de estas paradojas del pensamiento darwinista y se autoriza, vamos a decirlo así, como el combo al estilo McDonald's, se autoriza todo y entonces se empieza a pensar que el hábito tendría la misma función que en Darwin, pero yo creo que en el pensamiento psicológico se desmarcaron muy pronto de eso. Ahora, si es heredable o no, ahora, no sabría decirlo porque no hago estudios biológicos, pues, ¿no? Pero históricamente sucedió eso.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? Bueno, si no hay preguntas, la una, las dos. No, bueno, si no hay preguntas, muchas gracias, Darío. Tenemos el break para la comida. Regresamos aquí a las 3:30, ¿ok? 3:30 de aquí.